The following program is made possible by a grant from the Manti-La Salle National Forest and by the Sanpete County Heritage Council.
Sunday, April 9th, 1865. Across the Virginia countryside, the guns of war have fallen silent. In the small town of Appomattox Courthouse, General Robert E. Lee surrenders the Army of Northern Virginia to Ulysses S. Grant, and the two begin negotiations that would eventually bring a peaceful end to the Civil War. On this same day, more than 2,000 miles to the west, another peace meeting was taking place. But here, in the settlement of Manti in the Utah Territory, the outcome would be far different. 10 angry men were about to set into motion a series of events that would throw the territory of Utah into turmoil for the next several years. Compared to the conflict now ending at Appomattox Courthouse, this war would be minor. But to the men, women, and children living in Utah, it would be a relentless tragedy leading to enormous loss in property and human life. Hello, I'm Merrill Osmond. Although my family has always called Utah home, it has been only a few years since we've moved to central Utah. The peace and tranquility living in this area has been such a blessing for my family. It's hard to believe that Utah's most extensive Indian war once raged across this valley. In fact, it was here in Manti, on a peaceful afternoon much like this one, that the Blackhawk War began. But the events leading up to the war started to unfold long before that fateful day in 1865. Almost 20 years earlier, in 1847, Brigham Young led the first band of settlers into the valley of the Great Salt Lake. These members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints had been driven by religious persecution from Ohio and Missouri through Illinois and out across the Great Plains. Now these Mormon pioneers had finally found a place to call home. But the Utah Territory was already inhabited by Utes, Shoshones, Navajo, and other Native American tribes. Encouraged by opportunities for trade with the Mormons, the great Ute Chief Walker allowed the pioneers to enter his land.
In 1845, Chief Wakara, who most of the whites knew as Chief Walker, went on a hunting trip. And while he was in the Uinta Mountains, he had a dream or a vision. And in this dream, he was instructed about the coming of the Mormons. He was told that they would be his friends and that he must treat them with kindness. The Mormons did come then in 1847, and a short, actually, or a scant 2 years later, then Wakara and 12 Utes met with Brigham Young and requested settlers for the Sanpete Valley. They told Brigham Young that they wanted to have the Mormons live among them and to teach them the white man's ways.
When the Mormons come in at the beginning of 1847, around there, the Indians welcomed them because there weren't very many. But as the years went by, there was more and more of the settlers. They were coming in by the wagon loads, that the Indians were surprised to see the number of whites that were coming in.
What we have happening at the beginning of the white settlement in Utah is inevitably a clash between white and Indian cultures. Early on, there's numerous attempts by the Indians to accommodate white settlement. But there's always going to be an element that's going to be resentful. What happened is that the Indians, as they became increasingly hungry, as the whites introduced diseases which were devastating to the Indians, primarily smallpox, animosities will grow even among the Indians who had earlier tried to accommodate white settlement.
The Mormons regarded Native Americans as an important part of their own theology. The Book of Mormon depicted the Indians as descendants of Israel, the forgotten remnant of an ancient Christian civilization. Accordingly, most church members took careful steps to foster a relationship with the Indian people and to deal fairly with them.
Well, the Mormons, they established irrigation canals. They established ditches that turned the streams, the original streams that the Indians fished in and gathered water from. They plowed and planted crops, which they protected with fences to make their life more comfortable in this area. So our life changed. It made it difficult for them to survive in.
Brigham Young certainly in his heart wanted to help not only his pioneers have a safe refuge, but to help the Indians in their plights as well.
In an effort to reduce this hardship, Brigham Young devised a plan. He set up what he called Indian farms, one at Spanish Fork and others in San Pete and Millard counties.
Most people know Brigham Young, and I know Brigham Young from my study, as being a great colonizer of the West, a pioneer leading the first wagon trains across the West, and also as a great spiritual leader, being a prophet of God and leading the church at that time. But not many people know Brigham Young as the head of Department of Indian Affairs for the great territory of Utah. He was a great friend of the Indians and did much to help their plight. He started many Indian farms throughout the Intermountain West, sent missionaries down to try to help them be better at agriculture, growing crops, and helping them be self-sufficient. So he did great things to help the Indians, but unfortunately there were some real problems between the cultures of the Native Americans and the pioneers, and those cultural differences caused for a lot of strife over time.
Although the mountain valleys were their home, the Utes were a nomadic people, moving from place to place, living off the land. The idea of tilling the ground was incomprehensible. Most natives saw the farms just as another place to gather food before moving on. And when the federal government took over the Utah Indian Superintendency, the farms were abandoned. By the 1860s, the Indians were desperately poor. Many Indians survived by setting up camps beside Mormon settlements and demanding food. To the thrifty and industrious Mormons, this was begging. But to the natives, it was taking appropriate compensation for occupied Ute land.
The Indians' concept would have been, well, you've occupied our hunting grounds, so now I'm going to eat one of your cattle, slaughter one of your cattle, eat that. And that should presumably be acceptable because that's our way. We believe in sharing all of these resources. And the Mormon perception was, hey, you took some of my property, you violated my rights. So in many ways, these cultures were set up for conflict. They were so different. Perhaps the only thing they held in common was perhaps the belief in the Creator, an omnipotent being, and that the Creator was part of all things. So that was probably the closest they came in their beliefs, but it wasn't enough.
By the final days of 1864, resentments were overflowing on both sides. The winter was unusually harsh. Bands across the territory faced disease and starvation. For some Utah Indians, this was the last straw. And so, as 10 men met here in Manti on that fateful afternoon in 1865, the stage had already been set for a bitter conflict.
Into this environment stepped Blackhawk. Blackhawk had been a minor Ute chieftain from as early as 1850. All during the winter, Blackhawk and an associate named Jake Arapine had threatened the Mormons that they would steal Mormon cattle and actually kill Mormons. As the spring approached, John Lowry, a Mormon Indian interpreter, called Blackhawk and Jake Arapine and other Indians in to discuss the troubles and to see if peace could be worked out. At the meeting, Jake Arapine began to argue and began to get quite angry at John Lowry and actually drew an arrow. John Lowry, seeing this, grabbed Jake Arapine by the hair, yanked him off of his horse, and the two began to scuffle on the ground.
For the whites, the encounter was a simple fistfight, an altercation that occurred almost daily. But for the Utes, this incident became an indignity that could not go unanswered. The most extensive Indian war in Utah history was about to begin.
It's interesting that this was the incident that sparked the war. But by this time, the Utes had already decided that the time for war had come, so all they needed was an excuse. So when Lowry pulled Jake Arapine off his horse, this act was symbolic of the conflict between their people.
The next morning, April 10th, a group of young men rode out from Manti to scout for and round up the settlement's cattle. What they found was something else entirely.
My great-grandfather was about 20 years old when he went out with a group of young men to survey for cattle.
They went south 6 miles and from Manti in a field where there was grazing for the cattle, and that's where Manti's cattle were at this time.
They saw the Indians come riding off the east hill, and Peter Ludvigsen said, "Here they come and they'll give us hell." Michael and the others said, "No, they won't, because you're friends." And about that time, a bullet hit Peter Ludvigsen.
Of course, he fell from his horse, and the other boys scattered as fast as they could and returned to Manti to tell the sad news.
And as they looked back, they noticed that the Indians had surrounded Peter's body.
The Indians took the body of Peter and brutally and savagely cut it down the back and cut a piece of meat from his spine. This was a sure sign of war. The boys that was with Peter at the time went back as soon as they felt it was safe and took white strips of linen and carefully wrapped his body in this. And this is the way it was delivered to the family. And his mother was never told or never knew of this awful thing that took place. But the one thing that was very important with Peter's mother was she always said she knew that the Indians had not always been treated fairly. And so her animosity towards the Indians just wasn't there like we might think it would have been. And she was able to accept them if they come to her door for food or whatever. And we think that was beautiful of her, in her spirit, to be able to do this.
Working quickly, Blackhawk gathered about 40 head of cattle, then headed south, rounded up more livestock and warriors as they plotted their next move. Today, Interstate 70 runs through the Salina Canyon. However, in 1865, this pass was Blackhawk's escape route. Unaware of trouble, two herdsmen from the nearby town of Salina headed up the same canyon in search of lost cattle. Blackhawk and his men lay in wait. Both herdsmen were ambushed and murdered. In all, Blackhawk's first raid had garnered about 125 head of livestock, including all of Salina's horses and cattle. Settlers responded to the attack by alerting their local militia, a branch of the Mormon armed force known as the Nauvoo Legion. The next morning, the militiamen headed up the canyon to retake the cattle and punish the raiders.
Colonel Reddick Ann Allred was with his cousin, John Lehigh Ivy. They had 84 men with them that they were leading up into the canyon of Salina. As they went up this mountain, the trail became narrower and narrower. They were following the trail that the Indians had left. As they got to a point where the trail was so small that they had to go single file, a shot rang out from the Indians, and this was followed by a vast number of other shots. One soldier described it as like hail coming down. The bullets were so thick. Colonel Allred, of course, ordered a retreat, and as they went down the mountain, he was thinking he was going to flank the enemy. But some of the men misunderstood, and they thought he ordered a total retreat and went down the trail. This actually was very fortunate because the Indians were also trying to get down behind and cut off the retreat.
Hamilton Kearns, the Mormon bishop in the town of Gunnison, waited anxiously at the mouth of the canyon for his 2 sons to return from battle. Only one came back. William Kearns was one of the 2 militiamen killed in the canyon. In an effort to retrieve the bodies, Bishop Kearns sent out for help of a powerful Ute chief named Sandpitch. Sandpitch consented to scout the canyon and make sure the whites could enter safely. But Sandpitch was caught between conflicting interests. He was the uncle of Jake Arapine, and later many would accuse him of warning his nephew and helping the raiders flee the canyon with the stolen stock. The following day, while retrieving their dead, the Mormons found one of the bodies horribly mutilated. The Utes regarded this as a routine part of warfare, but the act outraged the white settlers and inspired vicious hatred. In contrast, because the Kearns family had always treated the Indians kindly, great care had been taken with William's body.
It was interesting also that this particular William Kearns had grown up with some of these Indians that were up there and had gone hunting with them and was a very good friend. And when they found his body, the Indians built a sort of basket over his body to protect it from the wolves and leaned it against a rock so they couldn't touch it.
This kind of discrimination would be characteristic of the Indians throughout the war. Few of these Native Americans would regard themselves as the enemies of all Mormons in general. Most felt they were fighting only against the settlers or communities that had wronged them. Immediately upon his return to town, Bishop Kearns wrote 2 letters asking for assistance. Both letters were to be sent to Brigham Young, and if the church president agreed, the second letter was to be forwarded to the commander of the federal troops at Camp Douglas in Salt Lake City, asking for the Army's help. By mistake, the second letter went directly to the post commander. Brigham was alarmed. He had consistently refused to ask for federal support in Indian matters, and for a good reason. In his mind, cultural differences between Mormons and Indians were making relations difficult, but only for the time being. However, cultural differences between the Mormons and 19th century American society had engendered a more far-reaching animosity. Authorities in Washington looked upon the religious society as a government unto itself, not unlike the secessionist South. These notions were probably caused by attempts to unseat Brigham Young as governor of the territory. In defiance, Brigham organized Utah as the state of Deseret and prepared to assume independence if his people were not allowed to join the Union. Outraged, President James Buchanan sent federal troops to occupy Utah in 1857. These troops were replaced by a volunteer army from California at the beginning of the Civil War.
The leader of this volunteer army, the California Volunteers, was a man by the name of Patrick Connor. As a military leader, he was very, very brutal. When the army was marching to Utah across Nevada, numerous Indians were killed under questionable circumstances. Upon his arrival in Utah, he established Camp Douglas near Salt Lake City and immediately sent several expeditions to Cache Valley, each of which involved the murder of Indians. The largest of this was in January of 1863, when he took a large contingent of men to attack and eventually to annihilate an entire band of Shoshone Indians. This is perhaps the greatest massacre of Indians in the history of the United States west of the Mississippi.
Ostensibly in Utah to protect the Overland Trail, Connor made disbanding the Mormon theocracy a personal vendetta. In an attempt to intimidate church officials, he trained his howitzers directly on the home of Brigham Young. Consequently, Patrick Connor was looked upon with disgust by Indians and Mormons alike. And so, church authorities now watched nervously to see how Connor would respond to Bishop Kern's message for help. Apostle Orson Hyde, a Sanpete County resident, felt the way the troops responded, or rather failed to respond, would demonstrate the military's involvement in the attack. Colonel Connor's response only confirmed the suspicions. Since neither the telegraph nor the overland trail were threatened, the raids were outside the military's jurisdiction.
It's quite remarkable that someone of Connor's reputation, who was known for killing Indians with proper provocation and also with no provocation, would refuse to become involved in a war in Utah. It's quite clear that Connor had no intention of coming to the aid of the Mormons. They left them to their own resources. They would have to fight this war all by themselves.
Connor's antagonism made Brigham even more determined to handle his Indian problems internally. He would not allow the uprisings to be used as an excuse to bring more federal authorities to Utah. In the meantime, the Nauvoo Legion in Sanpete County had undergone a change. Distressed by his casualties and the stinging defeat in Salina Canyon, Reddick Allred had resigned his command. For the remainder of the war, the militia would be under the primary direction of Colonel Warren S. Snow.
During the Blackhawk War, Warren Snow was the chief implementer of Brigham Young's Indian policy. Brigham Young had given Snow orders not to expose his men to undue danger. As a result, Snow's men frequently complained that he was overly cautious and moved too slowly for them to actually catch Blackhawk. Meanwhile, the Indians held Snow personally responsible for the military operations the Mormons launched against them. While Snow became an archenemy figure to the Utes, they continued to hold Brigham Young in high esteem.
Brigham Young sent his son Joseph along with several other church leaders throughout the territory to preach peace. His message to the congregations was summed up in his better to feed them than to fight them policy. President Young was convinced that this approach would diffuse the conflict and discourage those few Indians bent on war. Even as Brigham Young preached peace, the raiders were on the attack again. In late May of 1865, the raiders swept through Thistle Valley in a wave of killings. A shepherd, a lone rider, and all 6 members of the Givens family were brutally murdered. Despite Brigham's instructions to cultivate peace, local settlers were ready for blood. In 1861, President Abraham Lincoln had established an Indian reservation in the Uinta Valley. Now the new Superintendent of Indian Affairs for the Utah Territory, Orsemius H. Irish, had been authorized by Congress to negotiate a treaty with the Utes and begin moving them to their new homes. Because of his rapport with the natives, both the Indians and Superintendent Irish looked to Brigham Young to help arbitrate the treaty. At the Spanish Fork Indian Farm, 16 Ute chiefs, Mormon church leaders, and Superintendent Irish met to discuss the terms of the treaty.
The treaty proposed by Superintendent Irish promised the Indians that if they would move to the Uinta Reservation, that the federal government would build them mills, would help them construct farms, would build schools for their children, would even build homes for their chiefs. But the Indians didn't trust Superintendent Irish. They didn't know him. On the other hand, they had dealt with Brigham Young for almost 2 decades now, and they sought his counsel.
If you do not sell your land to the government, they will take it, whether you are willing to sell it or not. They are willing to give you something for it, and we want you to have it. We have not been able to pay you enough, although we have helped you a good deal. But now the Great Father is willing to give you more.
Only Sandpits refused to sign, but he could only sit brooding in his lodge for so long. In the end, he gave in. Superintendent Irish was overjoyed.
The man who looks at you today and will look at you in a few years hence would not think you the same people.
Irish's prophecy ultimately came true, but tragically not as he expected. Outraged by Brigham Young's participation in the council, federal authorities had refused to attend. Although some Indians began moving to the reservation, the treaty was never ratified by Congress.
When Brigham Young realized that the federal government was not coming forward with the promised goods and food, he tried to make sure the Indians were fed. Numerous loads of clothing and food were actually sent to the Indians on the reservation, but Brigham Young's resources, being in a poor state, could not meet the actual needs of the Indians. With the best of intentions, Brigham Young had essentially set up some of the Indians to be cheated by the government, and Brigham Young was unable to retrieve the situation.
A later agreement would leave the Indians more impoverished than ever. But problems were just beginning. As the council concluded in Spanish Fork, a congressional delegation arrived from Washington, D.C. Speaker of the House Schuyler Colfax announced that their express purpose was to renew the government's campaign against polygamy and the Mormon theocracy. Congressman Ashley was especially direct. He informed the church hierarchy that now that the Civil War was over, the religious element was demanding the troops be sent to Utah to abolish polygamy. Actual warfare might come at any time, and when it did, it would be terrible. For the troops that would be sent were the refuse of Sherman's army. These same soldiers ravished every female and burned every house, for the scope of 50 miles wide, while humbling Georgia the previous summer. And that's what they intended to carry out here. Now, feeling the pressure from both sides, Brigham Young decided to take personal action. Convinced that church members could do more to defend themselves and promote peace, Brigham set out to visit congregations in Utah, Juab, and Sanpete counties. He was doing just that on July 14, when his meeting was interrupted in Manti by word of yet another Ute raid. This time, Blackhawk had attacked the small community of Glenwood, killing 2 men and taking over 300 head of cattle. His patience spent, Brigham ordered Warren Snow,
"Do your duty and say nothing to any man, and call upon nobody to help you, for you are able to help yourselves. Seek out the murdering Indians. Let the innocent go free. Use up these wicked Indians who are killing the inhabitants."
Now promoted to general, Snow gathered volunteers and headed south. Making camp at Grass Valley, Snow's men were startled by Indians hiding in the bushes. The militiamen fire indiscriminately into the brush. Snow raged at his men, but it was too late. The warriors had long since gone, and it was the women and children who had taken refuge in the stand of trees. Now most of them lay dead. This incident, which was to become known as the Squaw Fight, would enrage Indians across the territory. The Mormons of Sanpete, they concluded, could not be trusted. Warren Snow would become among the Indians what Blackhawk had already become amongst the whites, an arch enemy, an object of insatiable hatred and vengeance. Blackhawk continued with the stolen cattle toward Castle Valley. The canyons there were easy to defend, and the spectacular formations offered thousands of hideouts. A generation later, the area would be nicknamed Robber's Roost by outlaws like Butch Cassidy. In addition to the terrain of Castle Valley, the Indians had another advantage. Snow's men were poorly provisioned and the men largely inexperienced. Forts which had been constructed in earlier days had been allowed to deteriorate, or were torn down to build houses or other buildings. In the eyes of church leaders, the residents had not been faithful in protecting their own communities.
During the years of the Black Hawk War, there was an urgent and widespread effort to build forts across Utah. For example, you can see the remains of Fort Deseret down near Delta. The Moyle Indian Tower in Alpine, Utah, was a lookout tower that could also be used for defense. There are the ruins of Fort Pierce down south near St. George. And of course, there's Utah's most famous fort, Cove Fort, located between Beaver and Fillmore. Cove Fort, like many other forts, was never actually used for fighting. This was because the forts were mainly used to discourage the Indians from raiding the cattle. The Indians were not going to go in after cattle if they were in danger of being shot.
Tragically, the most peaceful natives were often caught in the crossfire, mistrusted by whites and threatened by their hostile brothers. Many such Indians were baptized Mormons and had worked as laborers on the farms and ranches of the settlers. In an effort to quell the growing hatred and violence, Brigham ordered the Mormons of Sanpete County to halt all hostilities against the Indians. At the same time, he sent word through various Ute messengers that he desired to contact Blackhawk personally and begin peace talks. Unfortunately, the citizens of Sanpete and Sevier counties interpreted Brigham's announcement as an end to the war. For some, this would be a fatal mistake.
In Ephraim, my husband's grandfather, Niels O. Anderson, and a friend were going up into the mountains. They knew there was a danger. There had been threats of Indian attack, but they felt that because there were so many loggers in the mountains that they'd be safe. They were only partway up when some of the loggers came running down and warned them that the Indians had attacked, that some of the loggers had been injured and some killed. Niels O. and his friends hurried back to town. They came to Gardnell, which is not the largest mountain, but from its top, it gives you a view of all the entrances and exits. And that was where this main protective fort was built. Niels O. hurriedly came to that point and sounded the drum. That was the alarm for an Indian attack.
Out on the main road, Blackhawk's men encountered a carriage en route from Manti. They gave chase.
When the Indians came out of Ephraim Canyon, they spotted the carriage, and one of my ancestors, Mr. Andrew Whitlock, was driving the carriage with Mr. Larson and a lady doctor, Mrs. Snow, in it. As the Indians approached, he just whipped the horses and made them go on through them. Mr. Larson climbed up over the dashboard and rode between the horses and the carriage. The Indians used up all their ammunition at that time and decided to use their bow and arrows and shot Andrew Whitlock in the back with one of the arrows. Once in the safety of town, Mr. Larson pulled out the arrow out of Andrew's back because the lady doctor at that time had become so hysterical she wasn't able to do anything. Andrew Whitlock suffered the rest of his life with that injury.
Continuing the raid, Blackhawk led several of the Indians to the west side of town where cattle grazed.
The speaker, William D. Gura, was born in Ephraim, Sanpete County, Utah. My parents came from Denmark, and in October of 1865, while they were gathering potatoes in the field west of Ephraim, a band of Indians appeared, bent on killing.
I've heard my grandfather tell this story many times to us as children when we would visit with him and Sandy, of how his parents were killed that day in October. And the Indians turned up towards my great-grandparents who were working in the fields, gathering potatoes. And as the Indians approached, then they started running towards the town. Martin picked up the child, but the Indians caught up with him and shot Martin. And then Hansine picked up the baby, and she was also shot. And the young girl that was with them was shot also. One of the Indians came and picked up my grandfather, and this was witnessed from the town, and they saw the Indian put him back down again for some reason. And later on, in the peace conferences that took place, it was found out that this Indian said that some feeling came over him that he just couldn't harm the baby, and put the baby back down and left.
In 1953, I attended a ceremony that was held in our Pioneer Cemetery, where the Curry family came to erect a lovely large granite marker that had the names of all those who were slain that day and an account of the event of that day. There was quite a large group there, but the one person that touched my heart was this William W. Curry, now a rather elderly man. He'd been miraculously preserved as a baby to complete his life and perform some great works on this earth.
Though beset by one trial after another, Brigham Young continued to promote nonviolence. During the next cruel winter, he continued to send shipments of food to the reservation. In spite of his best intentions, these donations of food could not stem the Indians' growing bitterness. As raids on herds and attacks on settlements continued, Mormon communities were overtaken by wartime panic.
Many people have the perception that that only the Indians caused all of the depredations during the Indian Wars, and this is encouraged by Hollywood attempts to stereotype Indian people as the bloodthirsty savage, and when in reality there were depredations on both sides, and sometimes there were acts of war, and other times they were just simply deliberate attempts to destroy one another.
Near Circleville, Utah, in 1866 was camped a group of friendly Paiute Indians. The settlers of the town were pretty suspicious and fearful of the Indians at that point in time. And they took the Indians into town and incarcerated the men in the Circleville meeting house and the women and children in a nearby cellar.
The Indian men broke jail. They were all shot down and killed on the spot. After having committed this deed, many of the white settlers feared what would happen if they released the remaining Paiute women and children. Clearly they would be in a position to tell other people what had happened, and they feared retaliation. They tried to make sense of, shall we say, an inexcusable decision. What they did was, one after another, take these innocent women and children up, broke their necks on a wagon wheel, and slit their throats. They only allowed 3 children, small children, to survive, whom they thought were simply too young to remember and tell the incident.
One of the surviving children was my great-grandfather. A white settler took him to Spring City, Utah, where he was traded to Peter Munson for 2.5 bushels of wheat. They took the boy into their home and gave him the name of David and their surname, Munson.
The Circleville Massacre was perhaps the most unfortunate incident of the entire war. This was a massacre to try to protect a crime and ended up protecting nothing, just showing to what lengths some people would go in war hysteria.
Fearing the worst not just from the Indians and the federal government, but from the settlers as well, Brigham embarked upon a desperate new strategy, one which would force the Indians to accept peace. On March 14, 1866, Warren Snow surrounded Sandpitch's camp near Nephi. The plan? To capture chiefs suspected of aiding and providing information to Blackhawk and the raiders. All of the 9 chiefs captured were known as friendly and offered little resistance. Snow was ordered to hold the chiefs comfortably until such time as peace was established. Upon learning of the captures, Daniel H. Wells, counselor to Brigham Young and head of the Nauvoo Legion, wrote,
"Should they see that you are so very pressing and determined that they shall share your hospitality, they may be induced to send for Blackhawk and Jake and their distinguished friends to come and visit and have all differences adjusted so that we can live together in peace."
The chiefs were brought to Manti and placed in a makeshift jail in the courthouse. They were allowed certain liberties. Their families could visit them. Their wives came with food. The chiefs sent out runners to Blackhawk and encouraged him to come in and make peace. But Blackhawk wouldn't negotiate. After about a month in confinement, the chiefs became very nervous and apparently worked out a plan for their escape. One night, the guards had relaxed their vigilance, and a Ute woman crept up the stairway leading to the door of the cell, and she opened the latch. And within seconds, all of the prisoners had jumped over the railing and spread out into the night. A passerby who had watched the escape shouted to the guards, "There go your damned Indians!" And Manti erupted in chaos.
When the chiefs escaped from Manti, there was some of them evidently were killed right in Manti. But Chief Sandpitch and a couple of his people made their way to Birch Creek near Fountain Green. I guess every town between Manti and Fountain Green had sent posse out to try and catch him, but they couldn't find him. But there was 6 people from Fountain Green was sent out to Birch Creek, which was Sandpitch's home. That's where he lived. And as they went up through the junipers, the cedars, they saw him sitting on a rock. And they went over to him, and when they got over by him, why, he raised his hand and he said, "Don't hurt me, I'm sick." But one of them did shoot him, killed him, and he fell off in the rock. And they tried to bury him where he fell, but there were too many rocks. They just couldn't dig a hole there. So they drug him down the canyon and out into the flat by a large rock there. And they did bury him by that rock. After they buried him, they come up on the rock and they fired their rifles down the face of the rock to make grooves and creases in the rock to mark it as his gravesite. The 6 men evidently took an oath that they would never tell who fired the shot. My grandfather was one of the 6 people, and he was only 12, 13 years old. So I don't think he had anything to do with their decisions or the actions they took that day. But my grandpa, along with the other 5 men, as far as we know, never revealed who did fire that shot. But it had to be a horrible feeling, I think, for the 6 of them to have been there and been involved in that type of thing.
Brigham Young was heartsick to hear of the needless killings. His plan had backfired terribly. To a regretful Warren Snow, he wrote,
"You could not feel any worse about their escape than we did. We do not want to kill the Indians. It is painful and repugnant to our feelings to have to resort to violence against them."
The ramifications of the slaughter were far-reaching. Now the Indians of the Uinta Reservation talked openly of joining Blackhawk. War threatened to engulf the entire territory. In a drastic move, President Young ordered the abandonment of all communities with fewer than 150 inhabitants. Leaving their homes, scores of Mormons relocated to the safety of larger settlements and newly erected forts.
When the order came to evacuate the communities, my great-great-grandmother was expecting a child. They had to evacuate quickly, and so they loaded her onto a grain wagon that was being moved out by the government. And on the way from Salina, where they were living, to near Gunnison, where there had been a fort built, she gave birth to what turned out to be my great-grandfather on the back of this grain wagon, escaping the Indians during the Blackhawk War.
By the summer of 1866, Blackhawk was one of the most powerful chiefs in Utah. The wealth accumulated from his raids had given him huge prestige and authority among his people. The whites now referred to him as the Red Napoleon. Nevertheless, at the peak of his power and influence, Blackhawk was about to stage a daring raid that would ultimately prove his downfall. On Sunday morning, June 10, 1866, Blackhawk and his warriors descended on the small settlement of Scipio. The raiders escaped Scipio with 350 head of cattle and 75 horses. They knew if they could drive the stock to Castle Valley, the Mormons would never catch them. But there was only one route the Indians could take. First, they would have to traverse the mountain pass called the Gap to reach the Sevier River. Once on the river, there was just one spot where they could cross, a shallow stretch called Gravelly Ford. Brigadier General William B. Pace was stationed nearby in Gunnison. When word reached him about the raid at Scipio, he went into action. Pace and his men managed to reach Gravelly Ford ahead of the raiders to cut them off. The Indians opened fire. The ensuing gun battle lasted 3 hours. In an attempt to rout Pace's men, the most valiant Ute warriors repeatedly galloped past at close range to fire. Finally, the bullet of a Mormon sharpshooter found its mark. The warrior retreated on foot with a vicious stomach wound. Today, most historians agree that the wounded raider was Blackhawk himself. Militia reinforcements finally arrived at Gravelly Ford. Unfortunately, in yet another mix-up, Pace mistook the distant horsemen for more Ute raiders. Pace ordered a retreat, and Blackhawk escaped with the livestock again. Even so, the battle would prove a turning point in the conflict. With the wounding of Blackhawk, the tide would gradually begin to turn in favor of the Nauvoo Legion. The first indications of this came 2 weeks later, when the raiders staged an assault here in Utah County.
There were guards that were patrolling the area across the Union Bench from the Spanish Fork Canyon to Hobble Creek. They rode into town and reported to Bishop Johnson that all was well. He told them all is not well, and he reported to them that the Indians had made a foray into the valley and had made off with 20 head of cattle and 30 head of horses from the Springville and Mapleton area. He further told them that Colonel Creer from Spanish Fork was mustering a group of people to go in pursuit after the Indians. There was some fierce fighting from both sides, and it soon became obvious that the Indians were overpowered. Apparently, they disappeared eastward through various canyons and defiles into the vastness of the Strawberry Valley. During the various battles of the Black Hawk War, this was one of the first times that the settlers were able to retrieve their livestock. The Indians were not entirely to blame, and we should not place blame upon them because they were being moved by a different culture. But nevertheless, we should have a sense of history. And even today, I take my children, my grandchildren, I take Boy Scout groups into this area to show them what happened during the time of this great engagement of the Black Hawk Indian War.
For the next year, the raids continued, but it was a futile effort for the Utes. Brigham Young's policy of vigilance in guarding the communities had begun to pay off, and the tide had turned. The Utes were tired and hungry, and their ways were succumbing to the new social order.
Leader never thought for himself, he thought for the betterment of all. In the beginning, they knew they would never win, but they did try to set in their way of thinking to go out, bring attention onto himself, to bring back so that the people could use that to help his people. We know we will never win, but we go out and make our voice heard, our actions heard, in order to bring the problem back and then solve it by talk.
On August 10th, 1867, in a surprising turn of events, Blackhawk himself appeared at the Uinta Indian Agency and asked for a meeting with newly installed Superintendent Francis Head. Suffering complications from his stomach wound received at Gravelly Ford and weakened by disease, he announced he was tired of blood and ready to make peace.
Blackhawk did more than talk peace. He was instrumental in getting his people together with the whites for a series of peace meetings. We know that he appeared at a peace meeting in Ephraim down in Sanpete County. And he also appeared up at Strawberry Valley in the Uinta Basin. And when he did this, the animosity faded and the healing began.
There had been many peace treaties signed, hoping that the Blackhawk War would finish. This was the last one. It was held in Mount Pleasant, Utah. And my father, who was just 9 years of age, had been chosen by the authorities to go to Indianola and bring the chiefs in. After they were all assembled, Bishop William S. Seeley invited all the chiefs to come to his home. This wasn't the end of conflict. There's always people that'll break the law. The Indians broke the law a number of times, so did the pioneers. But actually, they were becoming friendlier. They were better friends, and it was easier to negotiate now. Their lives were becoming more alike, and they were helping each other.
By the fall of 1869, Blackhawk knew he was dying. Anxious to make things right with the Great Spirit, the Ute chief determined that he would visit every settlement in peace that he had visited while on the warpath to personally ask for forgiveness.
At Blackhawk's request, we sent a message to President Brigham Young, which said that he was tired of fighting the Mormons and that he wanted to end the war if President Young would guarantee his safety. Mr. Sheldon and I took the message from President Young to Blackhawk in his store-bought wickiup. We read the message to him and explained that if he would keep his word and see that his people were peaceful, President Young would instruct the Mormon settlers that they must not harm any of his Indians. Immediately after the message was explained to him, Blackhawk told one of his people to make him a buckskin medicine bag to hang around his neck, so he could put the telegram over his heart. If anyone tried to kill him, they would have to shoot through President Young's message into his heart.
Accordingly, in 1869, Blackhawk visited virtually every Mormon settlement from St. George to Spanish Fork, accompanied by his brother Mountain. Blackhawk was allowed to speak in each congregation. While he expressed remorse for lives lost and cattle stolen, he stated that given the circumstances, he and his people could do little else. In the town of Fillmore, the bishop gave the people in the congregation the opportunity to respond to Blackhawk. One settler stood up and called him a murderer and a devil, and angrily shouted that he would never forgive Blackhawk. As in each congregation along Blackhawk's peace path, the bishop, following Brigham Young's instructions, called for a show of hands from all those who could forgive Blackhawk. The bishop also called for an opposing vote. There was only one dissenter.
Blackhawk was definitely a leader of great courage. I think he exhibited the highest degree of courage when he finally accepted defeat and finally accepted the need to atone for his offenses. And I think he exhibited the greatest amount of courage when he went around to all of the different villages and churches and apologized to the Mormon people for his depredations. And I think that required great courage and integrity. And I think that's what makes him such a wonderful figure in Utah history.
As his health continued to decline, Blackhawk returned to the place of his birth in Utah County. On the 26th of September, 1870, he died. The following day, his people buried him high on a mountain, overlooking the land he loved and fought for.
Blackhawk's story does not end with his death and burial. In the early part of the 20th century, a series of events would bring knowledge of the warrior chief to a new generation of Utahns and resurrect the memories of those who had fought him years before.
In 1911, there were a group of miners working at the nearby Syndicate mine who weren't having much success in the mine itself, and so they started thinking about the fact that they'd heard that Blackhawk had been buried somewhere close by, and they went looking for him. And in a rock slide near the mine's location, they found his grave. And they took his remains and put them in a nearby storefront for several years, where local people would go and marvel at who this Blackhawk character was.
That's tragic, and it makes me feel bad. All these years that he was out there, nobody done anything about it. They knew who he was. Why didn't they put him back after they dug him up, or not even dug him up at all? That what makes me real angry sometimes when you think about people that have no respect for somebody like that.
What happened to Chief Blackhawk was unnatural. When Native Americans bury their people, they bury them to remain in the earth, and those places are considered sacred. The Blackhawk case was handled under Native American Graves Protection Repatriation Act, and one part of that is the lineal descendancies. With Blackhawk, there were lineal descendants that were located, and that was the Mountain family. And I think that that's a real strong tribute to Blackhawk, that his family was there to take care of his remains.
When I was growing up, going to high school, reading history books, and reading about Blackhawk, I had no idea in my lifetime that I would be the one to bury my great-grandfather. That was forgotten, you know, he was gone, he lived, done his work on this Mother Earth, was about here. But I didn't know that we would be the ones to play a part in his reburial.
In an ironic conclusion to his story, men and women representing the government, members of the Mormon Church, and the Ute Indian tribe can stand together at the side of Blackhawk's grave with a common purpose: to honor the memory of a brilliant chieftain who in life exploited differences and played each group against the other. A warrior who fought for ideals, his land and his way of life. A man who brought enemies together in the quest for peace.